Okay, it's Berlin briefing time, and today we're all about the nightmarish geopolitical squeeze that Germany has landed in between an aggressive Russia, a hostile White House, and a China whose car makers are threatening to eat Germany's biggest industry for breakfast. Well, the part of this story that's getting the least attention right now is Germany's relationship with China, and that will throw up some of the biggest dilemmas of all for the incoming government and for Germany's whole economic model. So to dig into this, I'm joined by Andrew Small of the German Marshall Fund think tank here in Berlin, and DW's Melissa Chan is with us from Taiwan. So it's great to have you both with us. First of all, we're going to get up to speed on why Germany and China are so interlinked. And then we're going to explore whether Berlin can handle crises with both Beijing and Washington at the same time. And finally, we're going to look ahead to what to expect in the next few months. So all of that coming up. But first of all, let's get started, Andrew. And I want to set the scene with you, first of all. A lot of people know that Germany and China have this kind of close economic relationship. Can you explain why that is, how that emerged?
So if you go back to when China joined the WTO back in 2001.
World Trade Organization.
This was a period of time in which, if you're the United States, if you're parts of southern Europe, you took a bit of a hit from Chinese exports, not Germany. And when we talk, as I'm sure we will later in this discussion, about the China shock, Germany didn't have a China shock. German industries were extremely complementary to the economic takeoff that we were seeing in China through this period. So whether it was the automotive sector or chemicals or machine tools, this was a period of booming exports between China and Germany. Significant increases in the production facilities that were put in China through this period. But there was a real phase in which there was an understanding that the two sides did have a complementary relationship. And when you go back to the Eurozone crisis, this was one of the sources that was sustaining German economic growth through a period that was otherwise the economy was facing extreme pressure. So I think there's a legacy there of the economic relationship that has still informed German policymakers' views, the dynamic between the two sides. Of course, if you go back further, party-party relations, political relations are there. But I think it's been that booming, mutually complementary economic relationship that's been at the thrust of it. Unfortunately for Germany, one that's now started to come to an end.
Yeah. So just to quickly flesh out, so basically Germany was there able to help China kind of become this manufacturing powerhouse that it became, right? So Germany made the machines that helped China make the little widgets, right?
Yeah, and sold a lot of the luxury goods that the new consumers in China wanted to buy and that China couldn't produce itself. And that's really been the thing on both counts that's been shifting in the last period of time.
Yeah, and Melissa, so you're out in Taipei. Let's just get the view from China, though. So as we heard from Andrew, this was a complementary kind of symbiotic relationship, right?
Absolutely. And I'm reminded by what you guys have been talking about, those machines in China. I mean, when I was based in China, visiting a lot of factories as a reporter, when you walked around, the machines that they were using to produce the widgets and the toys and the electronics that would then be exported were all, it was all German. And in the interim period, what we have seen is that a lot of Chinese companies have since learned how to make the machines that make things for the rest of the world, and have essentially crowded out and become a more affordable, alternative for manufacturers around the world to go to instead of German companies that produce these big machines that make all the things that we need. And so that sort of mutually beneficial relationship is just not there as much. And frankly, even when you're walking around Berlin, as you know, those advertisements for the Chinese electric vehicles, BYD, is a stark reminder of just how much the German automotive industry has failed to innovate and keep up with the times, so that, once upon a time, Chinese consumers wanted to buy German cars. They loved the Audis. They loved the Volkswagens. And they still do, but there have been so many alternatives, domestic alternatives that Chinese consumers have turned to that has made Germany, German automakers less successful. And that piece of the pie is getting smaller year by year, and they know that. So that's been the really difficult thing: is how do you pivot as Germany away from reliance on Chinese consumers of automotives when, frankly, that's your primary profit machine at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, there's something almost like a kind of a tragedy about it, right, Andrew? I mean, kind of German companies were involved in the building up of Chinese industry, and now Chinese industry has become so good partly because of, that kind of learning curve that they had hand in hand with German companies, that they're now coming back and threatening to kind of eat them for breakfast.
Yeah, and it's a triple hit for German companies. They're seeing their market share in China dropping in these sectors. They're seeing pressure in the European market from Chinese competitors, and they're seeing pressure in third markets as well. And this has, of course, been compounded by the weak economic conditions in China and the massive additional levels of support that the Chinese government has given to some of these industries, which was there before. I mean, this is not just sectors where China is becoming more competitive by fair means. These are all areas in which the levels of subsidies that have come from the Chinese government to build up these industries, not purely through direct financing, but through land pricing, through cutting out of foreign competitors in some of these sectors. There's been a huge push for the Chinese economy to build up its capacities across all of the advanced sectors. And this is why Germany is now being hit. These are the sectors that were supposed to be the future of German industry, the future of the European economy. And these are all sectors where China has kind of had this push for domination that is now being accelerated by essentially the weak economic conditions in China itself.
So we've had, I mean, this hasn't happened all at once, but this has been a process that is kind of beginning to really become a crisis for Germany. In recent years, there has been a shift within Germany and within Europe, beginning to see China as more of a risk. And it's partly on these economic levels, but it's also geopolitics. It's the threat to Taiwan. It's this sense of a kind of a struggle between democracies and autocracies in the world. And this term of de-risking has come up, particularly on the European level, but that's also fed into German politics in recent years. But the outgoing government was pretty divided on that, right, about how far to go on this idea of de-risking. So, Andrew, before we move on to kind of the present day, can you just quickly explain what is the term of de-risking and what were the divisions within the outgoing German government about that?
So de-risking was specifically distinct from decoupling, and it came about because there was a view that the US and Chinese economies were heading towards a sort of a bigger rupture, and that Europe did not want to head in this direction, that Germany didn't want to head in this direction, but had to take a different view of risk. And risk that was partly a reflection of what we saw during the pandemic, that there were a series of sectors where Germany was extremely dependent on imports from China. And then this was compounded by the Russia shock, essentially, that if you were dependent on a kind of hostile power and debates about what status China had, that this posed another set of risks. Because of course, China would not, it wasn't simply the risk of a single supplier being shut down, it was that this would be used coercively. And we saw China through the pandemic and beyond being willing to cut off things like rare earth supplies and things like that. So the view was you needed a different balance of risk in the relationship. You needed to make sure that your exposures and dependencies were not excessive, and therefore you needed to, in a series of sectors, identify those and put in place some policies that would actually lead to a rebalancing. Now, in Germany and in the German government, the coalition that's outgoing, the attitude was this should be left to businesses. Particularly, I think the view from the Chancellery, this should be left to businesses. You shouldn't proactively put these measures in place. German business should identify these risks and take these into account. The problem is a number of these businesses didn't de-risk. They re-risked. They put more investment in, especially this kind of cluster risk, as it's been called, of kind of the major companies, the automotive sector, the chemical sector, and the sense, if you look at the patterns of investment, it's German companies during a period of time in which a lot of major US firms are de-risking, a lot of other European firms are de-risking. German firms through this period actually increased the presence of their investment. Now, they called this de-risking because they're doing this as an in China for China strategy, as they put it. But I think the sense is that one was a lot of arguments came from some of the big firms about why this still fitted a sensible strategy. But I think there were views in other bits of the coalition, and I think to some extent, as we'll get onto in the present day, even some in the CDU, who've seen this as a level of risk that German companies are taking, where they will expect when they hit a collision point, like a Taiwan invasion, like a further confrontation in the South China Sea, that they'll be expected to be bailed out. And I think this has been the message from Annalena Baerbock. It's been there to some extent already already from Merz to say, you're on your own with this. But the question is that enough? Or do you actually have to take even more significant steps actually to push these companies to rebalance risk levels and reorientate supply chains because they're not going to do it themselves?
Brilliant. So that brings us to the present day. So, Melissa, I'm going to come to you in 1 second to get your reaction to a statement from Friedrich Merz, so the likely next chancellor here in Germany. Just before the election, he made a big speech about foreign policy, and he talked about China. And we have a clip from that speech that I'm just going to play. And we're going to play it first in German, and then I'll read out the translation, yeah? And then I'll come to you, Melissa. So, yeah, let's play this soundbite where he talks about China being part of an axis of autocracies.
Im Laufe der zurückliegenden Dekade hat sich eine Achse der Autokratien herausgebildet, die in allen Regionen der Welt destabilisierenden Einfluss nimmt, den politischen Westen zurückdrängt und krisenhafte Entwicklungen zu ihren Gunsten nutzt.
So that was Merz saying, Friedrich Merz, the likely next chancellor, saying that in the past decade, an axis of autocracies has formed, which is taking destabilizing influence all over the world, that is pushing back the West and is trying to make hay out of crisis situations. So, Melissa, whenever Western leaders say things like that, critical things about China, bundling China together with countries like Russia, North Korea, and Iran were the countries that he named, how do the Chinese react to that?
Well, it is not very much covered in Chinese state media or on social media. That kind of comment is suppressed on social media. It is censored. And so most people in China are not even aware that this was spoken. I would even add, to give you a sense of the kind of censorship and control, when U.S. President Donald Trump announced that 145% tariff, that was actually also censored on social media, which I am actually a little confused about, because if you're a manager at a manufacturing plant in China, of which there are many, you would figure this out very quickly. But it is, the way the state works and runs. They try to control the conversation. They don't want the conversation to go certain ways. There's been, I'm going off topic a little bit, but there's just been very little in terms of the actual negative impacts on the Chinese economy with this trade war with the United States. A lot of it is being suppressed, even though there are so many people in the manufacturing industry in China, and they are trying to talk amongst themselves. We've been able to pick up a few things on social media and online in terms of their thoughts and the actual impact, but most of the overarching message on social media and across state media is always very nationalistic. So just as a counterpoint to Merz's comment, of course, we have Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez visiting Beijing very recently. That was well covered. And, however you want to interpret it, his handshake and meeting with Chinese leader Xi Jinping was heavily used by state media. You can say that he was a kind of a useful idiot for Chinese propaganda. That's certainly one way of looking at it. But that is the view that your ordinary Chinese person is getting, that Spain has reached out, that there is an opportunity here for China to build better relations with Europe. The other thing is, I just don't think many people in China don't understand just how bad it has been for China to stand by Russia during this time when Russia has invaded Ukraine. Even at the diplomatic level, and perhaps the diplomats do know, but they can't act any other way thus. But there are enough people back home, including in leadership positions, that haven't fully grasped just how much of a wake-up call that was for Europe. And so, Germany, we've talked about the struggles of it trying to de-risk and the difficulty of companies, German companies, to do so, and to the point that, as Andrew pointed out, they've not really de-risked. They've actually doubled down in some cases. But nevertheless, ecologically, there has been a massive break, as we all know, based in Europe, in terms of how people view China, that I don't think is entirely being translated across to ordinary Chinese citizens.
Yeah. So bring that to you, Andrew. So Matt's trying to send a signal there that he wants to be tougher on China than his predecessors, either Olaf Scholz Angela Merkel going back before that. Also in the coalition agreements, so the agreement between Merz's Conservatives and the centre-left Social Democrats that will form the basis of the next government, it talks about this systemic rivalry with China. It holds that up as really the main issue of the relationship and talks about more strongly pursuing this policy of de-risking, what we were just talking about earlier. I want to also bring in what you were just pointing at earlier, what Friedrich Merz has been saying about investment. So he said, I think we won't play that, but I'm just going to read a couple of the bits that he said. So he said that, I say to all representatives of German businesses who are thinking of investing into China, I tell them that that is a decision with a huge risk, and essentially saying, if you come back to the German government, if China, say, invades Taiwan and say, oh, well, we're in trouble now because we invested all of that money in China, don't come crying to us about that. Bring these things together. What is the signal that Merz is sending?
I mean, the question here, we understand the overall signal, and some of these are almost just analytical points. I mean, these are the realities are that Germany is facing a China shock that poses a real threat to its major industries. I think this is very clear. It's also very clear that China's backing to Russia is going to continue, is going to deepen, is going to persist. If the analysis is that we are potentially we may find ourselves even in a wider war with Russia as Europe in the years ahead, going beyond Ukraine, then when we're talking about the China-Russia relationship, we're talking about China extending backing to Russia, its military-industrial build-up, in ways that will be a direct and outright threat to the European continent as a whole. That's different even from, I think, the Ukraine scenario that we've been dealing with. So that's the axis of autocracies. All of these are just a description of the new reality that's faced. The question is going to be, are there really meaningful moves beyond criticizing the companies that take this new framework into account? So are we going to see defensive measures that the past German, that the outgoing coalition was unwilling to take in the automotive sector among a tiny number of countries that voted against the tariffs on EVs? Is this going to be the orientation that the new government pursues, or is it going to join with the rest of Europe and be willing to pursue defensive measures in some of these key sectors? Or is the approach to de-risking as well when it comes to the technological dimension of this? If we're talking about a scenario in which we could be at war with Russia and we have exposures in the telecom sector and other digital sectors to China, its most important partner, is this not a higher level of risk that we will need to navigate in the years ahead? Do you de-risk in these sectors at greater speed? I don't think we know the answers to this. We see the kind of general signaling, but the crunch on this is going to be whether these kinds of measures are pursued in light of the level of crisis that Europe is now facing that you outlined at the beginning, a simultaneous economic, geopolitical and security crisis.
And Melissa, let's bring in the US elephant in the room right here, because, of course, at the same time as all of this is happening, Donald Trump has been getting pretty hostile towards Europe in a lot of his statements and also statements of J.D. Vance, his vice president. We know that there are big question marks about about where the US is going in terms of NATO. At the same time, Trump has launched a trade war not just against Europe but also against China, and on a much higher level than China. Give us a flavor a little bit about how that is playing out in China, this sense of, okay, it's really kind of full-on gangbusters trade confrontation with the US right now.
I think some of the commentary on Chinese social media that's allowed to happen, as I said earlier, that nationalistic flavor, some of it has actually burned across to Twitter and Instagram. I don't know if either of you guys have seen some of the things, but the ordinary Chinese citizens, maybe with a little bit of help from propaganda, have been doing some what I call Class A trolling, creating visuals of U.S. President Donald Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance at labor in a factory using AI and creating these video montages where Chinese pentatonic music is playing on the soundtrack, because of what the American president has said, that he would like to onshore more manufacturing. So there is a flavor of people making fun of the Americans for wanting to do that, sort of with the message of try us. see if you can make the things that we can make. But on the other hand, some stuff is being suppressed in that. Quite a few Chinese citizens have actually, I've seen online, said, this is actually a backhanded thing. These AI-generated video footages remind us of the plight of the ordinary Chinese worker. Well, that quickly got censored. But the nationalistic thing, I just want to share a few things, like the hashtags that we've been seeing on Chinese social media, right? Hashtag, we will fight to the end. Hashtag, China doesn't provoke trouble, but it isn't afraid of trouble. And then here's what I call the sick burn hashtag. The U.S. wages a trade war while it's pleading for eggs. So that is the kind of messaging that's being allowed on social media. But like I alluded to earlier, among the actual managers and owners of factories and the manufacturing industry, they are very concerned. Just a sort of ballpark figure, it seems like, and we won't know, but it seems like a lot of manufacturers have put their production on hold. They're in a wait and see mode. Some people are desperately looking for alternatives for moving their product, not to the United States, but elsewhere. But there are limits. And I'm sure you might talk a little bit about the anti-dumping measures that the EU is preparing because they're concerned about that. But it's not just the EU. It's also Southeast Asia, where Chinese leader Xi Jinping has been visiting. They've been very warm with him, but they're also worried about Chinese products flooding their markets. And then, there's some manufacturers who say that I guess they'll have to increase their prices. And that's going to, of course, hit American consumers. But look, it's also going to impact Chinese citizens as well, right? It's a two-way street, a lot of exports from China. But one example, right? American soybean farmers. They export soy to China. That soy is being used not for soy milk, but it is being used to create feed for pigs. And pork is a massive consumption meat in China. And so what happens if the American farmers are no longer able to export as much to China? The cost of everything for the Chinese is also going to go up. So there are no real winners. And I think the Chinese economists certainly know that, and quite a number of the policymakers. But online, on state media, they're flexing their muscle. They're saying, we can do it. We can outlast the Americans. We can then win this war.
So, yeah, a kind of full-on febrile situation between the US and China right now. Until now, it's always been a discussion in Europe that Europe and the United States can both deal with these trade issues with China better if they work together, right? But Donald Trump has launched a trade war against Europe at the same time, on a low level, but still hostile. Do you see any scope at the moment? Friedrich Merz, in an interview recently, did say that he wants to go and talk to Donald Trump in their first conversation. He wants to talk about China and trade and Taiwan, all of these issues. Do you think there is any real scope for Europe and Germany and the United States to work together on this? Or is the kind of the all directions disruption of Donald Trump going to make that almost impossible?
It really doesn't look very good at the moment on this. I think the European side at the EU level and a number of the main member states had expected that when this administration came into office, that China would be a really big focal point and that there were things that the two sides could do together. We face in a number of these industrial sectors, this China shock concept, I think, has really become quite embedded. There's an understanding that with the level of excess capacities China has, the flood of goods going into all of these markets, including our own, that we're going to have to take action in order to, whether it's by trade measures or other restrictions that can be put in place. Otherwise, some of these industries are going to go down. So I think the view had been you can work with the US on this. There's an overlap of issues and concerns here. The Trump administration has been very uninterested in talking to the Europeans seriously about the China question so far when it comes to trade. They've basically taken an approach that says we can do all of this simultaneously. We can do it ourselves, and we're not going to make any concessions in terms of hitting you harder as Europe but this is true of other allies as well, just because our China problem is bigger. So what it's meant is essentially Europe is left fending for itself on both fronts. And because the China tariffs that the US has put in place, of course, mean that there's additional spillover through trade diversion. And the Chinese have also been devaluing their currency for the first time. You've seen it depreciate against the euro by about 10% or so in the last month or so. So it's further pressure on the European market again, and again further pressure on third markets because you've lost that absorption capacity in the United States, which puts further pressure on the Europeans. So I think the problem right now is Europe is probably going to be stuck dealing with this itself. It's going to be primarily about what defensive measures Europe puts in place at the EU level. They may complement some of the US measures, but for now there's going to be very little coordination. Now there's, I think, been some hints in the last week or so, particularly with Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent talking about the idea that maybe the US could pivot towards more of a kind of coalition-based effort to deal with China, their main trade problem. But I think in the talks that have taken place with Lutnick, Jameson Greer and people like this, we're not in that zone yet. And until you get to that kind of wider conversation that looks at the future of these industries, what the two sides need, what they can do together, we could get there. But for now, it's pretty much still that the EU is stuck in all-out trade war with the United States as well, even if not on the scale that China is.
And is there a flip side to this? I mean, there's been some talk, and some people look at things that the head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has been saying, which sounded a little bit friendlier towards China than in the past. An anticipation that, well, maybe what happens with all of the disruption, all of this uncertainty about the US-Europe relationship, the voices in Europe become louder saying, well, actually, maybe we need to go a bit softer and kind of make nice with China because the United States has gone off the reservation. Do you see that being a likely path, or do you see that discussion kind of getting noisier as time passes?
I think the general expression that this might be a good idea has bubbled up from some corners. As you were mentioning, the visit of the Spanish Prime Minister, and I think they've been particularly enthusiastic about this. I think the mainstream view is still that these two conditioning factors, China's backing for Russia and the structure of the economic relationship between China and Europe now, precludes doing that much. It doesn't mean that there can't be some kind of modest political gestures between the two sides in the next period of time. Of course, if China's willing to go through the sorts of steps that Japan took in the 1980s, like export restraint to deal with the impact on the European market of these overcapacities, then there's a conversation to be had. But they haven't made these offers yet. And so although there's been a sort of modest softening of the language from the Brussels end, when you see the measures that are being pursued and the measures that are being lined up, I think the expectation is you're going to have to remain pretty tough in order to protect European industry in this environment. And so I think it's going to be very difficult beyond some of the optics that I think we may get with the EU-China summit. When it comes to the substance of it, I'm not sure there's much room for maneuver, frankly, on either side.
Yeah. So EU-China summit, that's one of the upcoming things we can have a quick check-in on at the end. But Melissa, I just want to come back to you. So I mean, I know one EU official I was in a briefing with recently said, there's been a lot of expectation in Europe that the Chinese might do a charm offensive towards Europe because they see Trump being so disruptive and think this is an opportunity to try to peel the Europeans away from the United States. But they said that this charm offensive simply hadn't arrived yet. I mean, do you see in what we're hearing from the Chinese side that they are likely to be making kind of positive overtures towards the Europeans?
You would think so, and I'm actually a little surprised about that. I mean, I've been hearing that as well, that the charm offensive has not quite arrived in Europe yet. But in terms of the messaging on social media that they allow, some of the messaging in Chinese media, it seems like they would welcome that and want to build a stronger relationship with Europe. So perhaps it's just because it's been so chaotic with the Trump administration that the wait and see mode is still turned on for now, and that we'll be seeing the moves from Beijing in the next few days or maybe over the next week.
Yeah, so let's get to this outlook, yeah? So what we have coming up is, you just mentioned it, Andrew, so an EU-China summit. Tell me a little bit about what we might expect from that.
So, I think the question for the EU-China summit is going to be whether there's any movement on the economic front? Is there a sort of mini deal of any sort that can be done? Or is this just going to be, as with the last EU-China summit and with the last time Xi Jinping was in Europe meeting with the Commission president when he was in France, whether we're basically just at deadlock on the major issues? Because, I mean, these last two summits were also primarily about China's backing for Russia and the impact of European industry of Chinese overcapacities. There has been no progress on any of these things so far. There is no progress expected on the China-Russia front. They're not going to do anything remotely constructive on Ukraine. I think there's an understanding there. The question is there some potential movement on the economic side? One element of that is going to be, of course, what the Chinese economy itself does through this period. Is there going to be any even modest reorientation towards a more consumption-based approach, or is it going to continue to be the level of doubling down on financing to some of these key export industries? Because that's the only thing that they've been mostly doing so far. Even then, I think even with an increase in Chinese consumption, this is still primarily going to benefit Chinese firms now. This is kind of the self-reliance rebalancing that we're seeing. So that's not going to make so much difference. I think the three elements that are being talked about between China and the EU are, one, can they do any kind of direct measures to restrict the impact of Chinese exports to Europe? Can they put limits in place? Can they help monitor some of these surges? And can this be resolved in a more politically amicable way? So that would be one piece. The other piece is investment. Are there sectors in which China can invest in Europe in ways that will have a kind of beneficial impact? I think there's a version of this that is not very beneficial to Europe, which is just final assembly plants that have Chinese supply chains, the sort of thing that we've seen in Hungary, for instance. I think the discussion is there any form of a benign investment in any of these sectors? China's very loath to do technology transfer. So again, I think this is going to be rather difficult, and they're loath to move towards a more European set of supply chains. So I think that's going to be tricky as well. And then, of course, there are the trade measures that China has put in place on the EU. There's been retaliation for the measures that the Europeans have been putting in place. The Chinese side could, of course, simply say, we accept that you as Europe are going to have to put some restrictions given the situation in our economy, the global trade picture, and so we will, again, deal with this in a politically amicable way rather than the way that they dealt with the EV tariffs, which was to put tremendous pressure on certain member states not to go ahead with them. So, I mean, that would be a mini deal. It doesn't add up to very much, but it would at least mean that the Chinese side could say, we have a more benign relationship with Europe than we had several months ago. And on the European side, it would mean you didn't have to put this slew of defensive measures in place because China might at least take some steps to mitigate the damage itself, though I think the expectations on all of this remain quite low.
Yeah. And Melissa, I mean, what would you say from the Chinese side? What is kind of the ideal, the sort of Goldilocks outcome for them in terms of relations with Germany and in terms of relations with Europe? I mean, is it simply to keep, a decent business relationship going that's as lopsided in their favor as possible and to keep the Europeans and the Americans as divided as possible?
Well, Richard, I'd just back up a little bit and actually say that one thing to keep in mind is that the Chinese economy going into this trade war has not been very good. It's been struggling. There's been lots of problems on unemployment and also the housing market. And the U.S. economy going in, relative to the rest of the world, the United States has been doing very well in the post-COVID period, even though a lot of ordinary Americans might not necessarily feel that way because they don't have a point of comparison. So I would say that Beijing, if they could have their way, would want to unwind a lot of this and they would prefer not to be in this trade war, frankly, and that this is just not very helpful for their economy. So that's what I would actually say in terms of what they want. They will do their best to make lemonade out of lemons is essentially what they have. So yes, they will try to engage more with the Europeans and try to build better bridges, both in trade and also in politics. But I think that if they had their way, they would prefer that none of this had ever happened.
And Andrew, I just want to end by sort of bringing it right back to Germany, because we're talking about the EU-China summit. But there's a sense in which Germany is a special case within the EU, which has often led to divisions between Germany and the rest of the EU about how to deal with China, because the Chinese market is so important for German exports, but also because Germany has these huge investments in China that look so vulnerable. So do you think this new German government, from what we see from Merz, from what we see about this overall situation, do you think it is in a good position to find a sweet spot that really helps Germany navigate this? Or do you think it's almost like kind of mind-blowingly difficult?
I think Germany's already done a huge amount to put itself and Europe as a whole on an optimal footing. I think the constitutional reform, the willingness to kind of the package that's in place there is potentially transformative. I mean, so
the constitutional reform to increase infrastructure investment and investment in the military as well.
Exactly. And I mean, if you look at the sums of money this could add up to, this is the single most important thing for Europe that could have been done to essentially not just the defence build-up, but just to shift the fiscal footing and to make that move means that I think during a period of time in which Europe is going to be weathering storms on all fronts, it's still going to have a China problem, it's still going to have a US problem, it's still going to have a Russia problem. And so first of all, putting the fiscal footing in place to be able to do that, to spend money in some of these areas, to be able to cushion the sectors that are going to be hit. I think the harder question on this is going to be on the China, on a sweet spot on China. I think Merz is now talking more accurately about the reality. I think we had something of an illusion from the outgoing government, and again particularly from the SPD and the Chancellery, about what this relationship could be. I think he's talked in terms that are much closer to the reality that Europe is facing, and that's an important start. I think it's already clear, as you've shown on the clips. I think he's going to be much more ready to message China hard when it comes to the relationship with Russia and some of these things. Not always publicly, but I think privately, I think these messages that are going to be delivered there are going to be very different. The crux, though, is going to be the economic question, because there isn't exactly a sweet spot. There's going to have to be a readiness on the German side and on the European side to be pretty tough on this and to show that in a world of predatory powers, Europe is not prey. And that means standing up on the China front and being able to do more as Europe, because you're not going to have anyone else you can rely on. There's going to be all of these external deals that can be done to help things. India, Indonesia, the Mercosur push, all of these things. There's a certain amount of shoring up that can be done. But this is going to be an extremely difficult time. And I think the footing that the new government that's coming in has, as a result of the deal that was done before they took office, is the hinge for this. But I think they're going to have to deal essentially with a pretty robust set of policies towards all of the major powers simultaneously. And that's going to be difficult to navigate.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So maybe the answer to this sort of dependency on economic relations with China is for Germany and Europe to build up its domestic economy and its domestic resilience more. So Melissa, maybe just over to you to a final word, because you're not in Beijing, you're in Taipei. I just want to give you a last word on that. So the coalition agreement does refer to Taiwan, saying that it wants to continue relations with Taiwan within the boundaries of its one China policy. It also talks about, sticking to the German line that there must be no changes to the status quo that do not take place without both sides agreeing. So just give us quickly before we finish, what is a Taiwanese perspective on all of this as it sees the crisis in Europe, this kind of dilemmas that European countries are facing when they're dealing with China, where Taiwan, of course, is facing that biggest threat of all of potential invasion?
I think Taiwan has been very concerned. I mean, Taiwan has a robust manufacturing base, as well, as we all know, and they are watching this. They themselves have also, of course, been the target of this Trump administration. It's been very clear that U.S. President Donald Trump does not like Taiwan, has accused Taiwan and TSMC and semiconductor companies of stealing from American companies in terms of their know-how, which is false. So this is a president that doesn't like Europe, that doesn't like Taiwan, and that makes this island very vulnerable, of course, because they've traditionally very much relied on U.S. as a non-committal security guarantor. So that's one concern. But the other thing, of course, is they've also seen what the United States has been doing in regards to Russia and how it's been treating Ukraine, and that is also a very serious concern. And a lot of people here in the national security space pivoting a little bit to try to see what they can possibly do to mitigate that. If indeed, I mean, it's impossible to predict, right, what is going on in Chinese leader Xi Jinping's mind. But there's always the possibility. And of course, we see the increased military sort of exercises and intimidation happening in this region that we just don't know what's going to happen over the next few years.
So many of the worries here in Berlin are mirrored elsewhere, in some of them in even sharper relief. Well, thanks so much, everybody, for watching or listening to Berlin Briefing this time around. Do subscribe on any podcast provider or leave us a comment on YouTube if you're watching us there. And also remember, do check out our Berlin Briefing newsletter. That you can find that on dw.com. That's a great weekly overview of what's going on in Germany. But for now, thanks a lot and see you next time.